Welcome back, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Melinda Banerjee. Melinda has researched and taught at Heidelberg University, at Presidency University in Calcutta, at the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in München. He is now at the University of St Andrews, where, among other things, he's kept busy as Programme Director for the MLIT in Global, Social and Political Thought. Just turn on my... Melinda has published prolifically on aspects of global intellectual history, British colonial history, South Asian history, political thought and political and economic theology. His first book, The Mortal God, Imagining the Sovereign in Colonial India, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, has been widely and critically lauded. He is co-editor of volumes on royal nationalism, dynasty, and legal thought. He is associate editor of the Journal of Political Theology and the founder editor of two series with De Gruyter, Critical Readings in Global Intellectual History and Trans-Regional Practices of Power. Now, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Melinda 6 years ago by our first BRIC postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Ilya Afanasyev, who sadly was unable to join us as chair this afternoon. My subsequent meetings and correspondence with Melinda have always been a pleasure and a great stimulus. His tremendous good humor, conviviality, and intellectual generosity are a model of how collaborative work in the arts and humanities should be. Today, he's going to share with us some of the fruits of one of the most recent of those collaborative projects with the anthropologist Dr. Yela Wutta of the Royal University of Bhutan, the manifesto Subaltern Studies 2.0, soon to be published by the Prickly Paradigm Press. And the title of Melinda's keynote today is Against the Capitalocene, from Subaltern Community to Multi-Species Democracy. Thanks, Melinda.
Thank you very much, Simon and Kate, for this fantastic invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back in Birmingham. And Simon, I think the first time I seriously started thinking about the political theology of value was after listening to you in Munich bring everything from saints' relics to modern capitalism into one power punch. And it is honestly a great pleasure to be back here again. So my talk here is, as it is about how to address the Capitalocene crisis and how to think with subaltern community and transformatively about multi-species democracy. So how do we call the present crisis? Amanda has already alluded to the multiple ways of thinking about it. One way popularized by scientists, but also taken by scholars like Dipesh Chakraborty and so on, is to talk about it as the Anthropocene, meaning it is that epoch where planetary world links have been irredeemably transformed by anthropos, by man. However, this has come up against the challenge that it is not man in the abstract who is responsible for the crisis. It is a very specific subset of humanity. So we are not talking about the indigenous Aboriginal population of Australia or the Native Americans who are responsible for the current crisis. It is really capitalist humanity. And that is why the term Capitalocene has also been used to designate this epoch, and particularly the current crisis, climate crisis, global warming, the sixth mass extinction, the alarming loss of biodiversity, the environmental degradation of human and non-human beings. In fact, in some senses, the genocidal forms of capitalism, if we take into account the non-humans, I was just reading a statistics that more than 6 billion chicks are slaughtered, male chicks are slaughtered with gruesome cruelty just to sustain the meat industry. And it's really, we are talking of entire ecosystems being wiped out. Now, the term Capitalocene has been popularized particularly by Andreas Malm and Jason Moore. And there's a very interesting debate between them, which we don't need to go at the moment, with Jason Moore dating that Capitalocene to the 16th century, to the early modern European colonial expansion, whereas Andreas Malm talks more about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and particularly the impact of fossil fuel capitalism. The British India was, of course, a very important pivot of that, Britain and India, the whole coal industry, and then later on in the 20th century, as Timothy Mitchell has pointed out in Carbon Democracy, with the oil industry and its intrinsic relation to American imperialism. So whether we take a 500-year view or a 200 to 250-year view, these are different ways in which scholars have talked about the epoch of capitalism. Another way to think about it, which Justin McBrien talks about, is to think of this as the Necrocene, the age of death. And this is, of course, because death is visited on human beings, but also genocidally on non-humans, which is something I just talked about. And in a way, the COVID-19 has only clarified this general atmosphere of suffering. We heard Dina talk about the crisis of care, which pervades this epoch. Now, the obvious question amongst all this doom and gloom is, what are the solutions? Andreas Malms's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, talks about the fact that we need to engage in activism, which deliberately blows up the infrastructure of fossil fuel capitalism, for example, through, and he takes specific activist examples, blowing up pipelines, blowing up or damaging SUV cars and things like that. Unfortunately, this kind of activism, of course, it is extremely well-intentioned, but it runs the risk of remaining kind of limited to middle-class voluntarist activism, to those who have that ethical tenacity, that courage to perform these activities. And it is not necessarily clear how sustainable it would be beyond these individual acts of courage, which is not to criticize Malm's solution, but to say that perhaps it needs to be combined with other pathways. Another important facet has been given by Thomas Piketty in Capital and Ideology. And Piketty talks basically about state-centric solutions focused on redistribution of wealth. And he suggests a number of solutions, for example, very high taxations, using that taxation to fund a capital fund for young people, and thereby to, in a way, make wealth more circulative than it is at the present moment. His environmental solution mostly relies on high taxes, high state taxes on carbon emissions. What is not clear from this perspective, however, is whether a redistribution alone can solve the problem, whether there is not a more fundamental problem, which doesn't have to do just with capitalist inequality, redistribution of wealth, but with the logic of capitalist production itself. And here I'm thinking particularly with Moishe Poston, in Poston's very well-known book, Time, Labor, and Social Domination. Poston points out that the big failure of the so-called actually existing socialisms, the Soviet Union, China, etc., was that they tried to abolish the capitalist mode of exchange and particularly through kind of sustained redistribution, reduction of social inequality. But the logic of capitalist production, of the commodification of human and non-human beings, was not really realistically abolished by any means. In fact, in the Soviet Union and in many other similar polities, the wage form, the commodity form, international commodity trade, all of these remained. And we know, for example, with Chernobyl and the broader kind of Soviet damage to the environment, that the so-called actually existing socialisms were not particularly better than the Western capitalist world in terms of their effects on the environment. And I would say a very similar argument could be made about the post-colonial states. In Asia and Africa, they often followed what Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru called the mixed economy, where a kind of condominium of the welfare state and the indigenous bourgeoisie tried to spearhead a kind of command-oriented economy and promote economic redistribution. But again, in India, Egypt, and elsewhere, the environmental costs on displacement of indigenous populations, on loss of biodiversity, etc., were enormous, which is basically to say that there is so fundamental a nexus between state and capital that it does not perhaps really make sense to think that capitalism has been abolished only when supermarkets have been closed down and some amount of redistribution has been done, whatever their good consequences, to in any way meaningfully dismantle capitalism, the logic of production itself needs to be dismantled. And that also means those kind of productivist ideologies whose very longue durée origins were traced back by Amanda just a few moments back. Now, how could we dismantle these kind of productivist ideologies? One major kind of way of thinking which has come up in the recent years is to focus on degrowth. And Georgios Kallis, Jason Hickel, they are two very important proponents. Basically, proponents of degrowth point out to the fact that this ideology of endless growth, which has long durée origins, but which particularly increased since the 19th and particularly since the 20th century, cannot be sustainable. We know from Philip Lepenius's intellectual history of the idea of the gross domestic product, or as the GDP, or as it was earlier called, gross national product, that in a way this was production where it was basically war by other means, because this kind of an idea of GDP, etc., the calculability, the statistic that comes up during the Second World War, and then is enhanced during the Cold War era with America, Britain, etc., using that to calculate their military strategic potential, and thereby to see how much they will be able to triumph against the non-Western world, particularly the Soviet Union. So this kind of focus on calculability, this kind of muscle flexing around numbers, this cannot be sustained in the long run. We need to tone down our obsession with growth. And how are we going to do it? And there, Kallis and Hickel are actually very similar in some ways to Piketty as well as to Malm, in focusing on two axes. One is voluntarism. So for example, we don't buy SUV cars, we don't use single-use plastics, but also on state regulations as well. And Kallis, in fact, goes to the extent of saying that we do need to preserve the nation-state system as it exists because it ensures international peace since the Second World War. Which is a bit of a short-sighted historical view, perhaps, given that nation-states were also responsible for imperialism and the two world wars and so on. But it basically relies on these two axes of state control, state policies and individual policies. Now, is there a different way of thinking about this beyond state control? And here I want to shift the attention from these kind of very European, North American environments to a very different setting. The picture on the left is of the Whanganui River in New Zealand, which thanks to sustained, in some ways, at least more than a century old, or at least decades old, agitation by the indigenous Maori people of New Zealand, who consider, many of whom consider the river to be their ancestor. This river was given legal personhood, and damage to the river was accordingly punished. And the act is really interesting because in a way it tries to fuse indigenous Maori perspectives with a modern Western constitutionalist perspective, and talking about the indivisible personhood of the river as it moves from the mountain to its mouth, and encompassing human and non-human beings. In another, and there have been other developments as well in terms of granting legal personality to other similar ecosystems in New Zealand. And there have, and this has been followed by kind of people citing that as a precedent in other parts of the world, including in the Indian judiciary. To move to another part of the universe, if we look to South America, particularly to Ecuador and Bolivia, we find really fascinating arguments being given, both at the level of state legislation, as well as in civil society activism, of the rights of the earth, of the rights of beings, and of the rights of nature. And this has been legislated in Ecuador as well as in Bolivia. From Bolivia, we have the Declaration of the Rights of the Mother Earth, and the picture on the right hand refers to that. And the concept of being, in the Spanish version of these texts, the word is ser, the English being, has become important in a way perhaps it has not been in political theory for a few decades now, because if we point to the question of being, of course, it immediately reminds us of Heidegger and the very problematic kind of fascist overtones to that. Or it seems a kind of an embarrassment to talk of being in the wake of postmodernism, where with Derrida or with Deleuze and Guattari, we have been taught to question ousia and parousia and so on. So anybody who raises the question of being seems to be an archaic embarrassment, but perhaps not in South America, where the question of being, where being is understood in terms of biotic as well as abiotic beings, but also more importantly, in terms of their indivisible interdependence, is being stressed on in very fascinating and radical activist politics, that how do we protect this, this interdependence of beings? Which brings me to the kind of developments in scholarly perspectives. And I've been very inspired by South American anthropology, particularly by the work of Marisol de la Cadena, but also Arturo Escobar and others, Mario Blazer and others. So Marisol de la Cadena works on the Andes, particularly on Peru. She looks at, for example, the understanding of the Tiracuna, which is a word, indigenous Peruvian word in Quechua for earth beings, which can refer to mountains, lakes, and similar bodies. And she talks about the interdependence between indigenous human and non-human beings while fighting against white settler colonial capitalism, landlordism, and so on. And this is a very, very fascinating kind of vocabulary around being, which is being theorized by scholars. Or if we take another perspective, that of multi-species ethnography, Tom Van Duren is a pioneer in that. Van Duren's work on crows is absolutely magnificent. It was one of the books which really changed the way how I think, because Duren points to the fact that all those things that political philosophy has taught us to think as very typical of humans, actually crows have them too. Crows can differentiate between individual other crows and other humans. They can accept the gratitude of humans and give them gifts. Voila, Marcel Mauss did not think about that. They have very strong understandings of fair and unfair behavior, what we might call justice, really. They can use fire and innovate tool use, all those classic things which in our school textbooks we were told were human monopolies, which makes us question that if crows, and there's been other scholarship on other beings as well, Luke Rendell's work on whales and dolphins also having understandings of fairness and justice, both in intraspecies dealings as well as in interspecies dealings. That makes us question that how can we think of justice beyond the human? How can we think of more than human justice? Which brings me to my next point, that in a way, how can we again bring back some of the energies of subalternist theory back into the game, back into our questions? So subaltern studies had originated, of course, in the long aftermath of decolonization in India, but particularly in the wake of the ultra-left Maoist, the so-called Naxalite rebellion in India. Its peak was in the 80s and 90s, spearheaded by figures like Ranajit Guha, Partha Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakraborty, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, and so on. And the basic argument in different forms was that it was local communities, particularly peasant communities, who were the main forces that were instrumental in dismantling the British Raj, in challenging colonial state and capital. So it was the local communities which could fight against the colonial state, against moneylenders, against landlords, and so on. And community was posed there against capital as political economic form. However, with the rise of neoliberalism in India, that's about the 1990s, 2000s, gradually the energies of subaltern studies dissipated. Shumit Sharka speaks about the decline of the subaltern, and in some ways, subaltern studies became a species of cultural studies. What Yele Butters, who is present today, and I'm really happy that he could be present, he's now in Bhutan. What he and I, this is our most recent book. It's in press now, so it's going to be published in September. We were very lucky that Gayatri Spivak, Marisol de la Cadena, Tom Van Duren, and the fantastic Dalit scholar Suraj Yengre all agreed to write commentaries for this piece. So it consists of our piece as well as their pieces, in total about 40,000 words. What we are calling for is a revitalization of subaltern perspectives, where communities in interdependence will fight together against extractivist neocolonial state and capital. Now, one of the problems perhaps of Subaltern Studies 1.0 was that they often focused on local communities, often in their particular isolation, fighting against the colonial state. But we live today in a world of globalization, and any local community fighting together against state and capital perhaps do not stand much of a chance, however much we want them to, because capital ultimately pulverizes communities. It creates class, and it creates or reinforces, accentuates class and gender inequalities that are present within these communities, and ultimately kind of separates off elites and subalterns within those communities and makes the elites into subaltern functionaries of the working of state and capital. So we really need to think in terms of multiple communities learning from each other. For example, let's say indigenous activists learning from feminists, or queer activists learning from different peasant communities and so on, to think about each community eroding its own internal class and gender inequalities while together fighting against oppressive ruling classes. We call this fungal internationalism because there's a fantastic book by Merlin Sheldrake, which was also really awe-inspiring for me, where Sheldrake talks about how trees and fungi coexist with each other. Now, in traditional philosophy, we often think about the arboreal model has been the reigning element in philosophy: one tree, one root, one nation, the search for the root, the search for nation, the search for one's own supposedly true religion. And as opposed to that, Deleuze and Guattari talk about the rhizome as a model against the tree. But in fact, what scientific scholarship really shows biologists like Sheldrake is that it's neither about trees existing in isolation, nor about fungi and rhizome. It's actually all of them exist together. So trees and fungi, tree roots and fungi, they exchange nutrients, they exchange information, often in ways they alert each other against common enemies by, for example, stressing out stress alerts and things like that. So in a way, the different communities coming together would be a bit like trees and fungi bonding in cooperation, and thereby a new kind of, not the United Nations, but a world fungus, where communities will coexist with each other to protect each other from state and capital. Now, when I mean capital, I mean, this was one thing which was raised earlier in the earlier session, that how do we think of a history of capitalism? Is it something really just 500 years? And how do we think of its relation with state? Now, Alfred Sohn-Rethel is a very interesting theorist, a German theorist, who points out that it is through commercial exchange that the so-called real abstractions develop, categories like value, like labor, like capital, which are abstract, but which are also ontologically real, because it is through commercial exchange that there develops, for example, the notion of a general equivalent or universal equivalent, to use Marxian language, and money becomes the embodied form of that general equivalent. But what has been missing in Sohn-Rethel's understanding about real abstraction is the real role of coercion. And me coming from India, from a kind of society very much conscious of colonial legacies, I don't think it's possible for me to think about money or capitalism without the very oppressive and often genocidal effects of colonialism. And they have been very, very inspired by Ilya Afanasyev, Lorenzo Bondioli, and Nicolas Mattheu's work. They're working together on a very long durée history of the state-capital nexus. And basically their argument is right from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia through the Middle Ages, what they call the Afro-Eurasian commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, right down to our times. State and capital really reinforce each other because states demand taxes, money taxes. Peasants are not able to give them, so they have to borrow from moneylenders. They fall into debt traps. So all kinds of really toxic extractivism comes into being. And there develops these kind of abstractions like money, like tax, etc. Basically, value is something abstract. And as communities are pulverized by state. So state and capital are really kind of, there is, I would call, an unthinkable difference and non-difference existing between them. Now, in terms of this very long durée logic, even if we don't speak about it. And I mean, there have been debates about whether there was capitalism in the Hellenistic world or Roman world and so on. We don't need to get into those debates, but what we can definitely say that capital accumulation is not something provincial to the modern world. I mean, it is capital accumulation, profit making. These were there in ancient India, Greece, Rome, and so on. What is specific to the modern world is that capital accumulation, the self-valorizing logic of capital, profit for the sake of profit, and this kind of karmic recycling, this becomes the general form of social relations only since the 16th century, perhaps. But there are elements of that before. Now, which brings us to the question, like, how does all of this relate to the non-human? And I've been very inspired by James Scott's work, Against the Grain, where James Scott talks about the state being an act of self-domestication. So the kind of technologies through which humans domesticated the non-human, they were now implemented back on the humans themselves. But James Scott has been questioned on this, that where is the evidence that of this kind of self-domestication? And James Scott, to be honest, does not really give a lot of textual evidence, as in some of his other work too. Even though it's extremely inspiring for us. Now, me as an intellectual historian, I don't want to be a text fetishist, but when texts give us the evidence, I always feel very happy. And so I went back to Yele and I. We read together some of the ancient Indian, Greek, and Roman sources. So if they look, for example, at the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is a really interesting text from the late to mid 1st millennium BC, the Shatapatha Brahmana talks about, it's a Sanskrit text. It says that initially the gods wanted to domesticate animals, and the animals resisted. The animals said, we don't want to be domesticated by the gods. And then the gods used a mixture of carrot and stick. The stick was basically threatening them with death. The carrot was the household fire, the Garhapatya. And through that, animals were cajoled into being domesticated. And I mean, scientific scholarship kind of sees this as very kind of plausible, historically plausible, that domestication happened through a mixture of threat of punishment as well as some sweet rewards. But another very interesting thing is, if you look at the Vedas, particularly at the Rig Veda and the Atharva Veda, the Rig Veda is composed sometime between the mid and end for 2nd millennium BC, and the Atharva Veda shortly thereafter. It uses a very interesting terminology to talk of the king. The human king or the divine king, Indra, are talked about as bulls, whereas the subjects are either talked about as female cows or as castrated male animals. In fact, detesticulized, the testes have been removed, the nirashta, it's a word which means the axils have been removed. And basically what this creates is a kind of trope where the king is in a way the sole phallus. The males have been emasculated and the females have been transformed into basically subjects of the king to provide milk. And the kind of traditional Indian understanding of kingship is the first king, Prithu, from which the earth gets its name, Prithivi. The earth turns into a cow and flees from the king, and the king chases him, threatens her with basically death, and then the earth gives up its produce for the king. And this is a trope which we find about 2000 years ago in the Mahabharata. It continues until today. So there is a very interesting way in which we have the evidence that the logic of animal domestication, where humans in South Asia, and Yele, it was really astonishing because Yele gave me the ethnographic evidence from Bhutan, that in Bhutan this still happens. One male animal is not emasculated, but the other males are all emasculated and transformed into baggage animals, and the females are all impregnated by that one remaining male, even though that male is then actually cast off from the crowd because he's too much of a threat to human sovereignty. So this kind of a logic of castration, of female subordination, etc., of the earth itself as a female and as a cow subject to the male bull, this kind of phallocentric, patriarchal, accumulative, extractive logic is central to the way that the state has been imagined in India. But that is not all. There is also resistance to that. So if we look at the Buddhist Jataka texts, which are written in Pali, or the Sanskrit Arthashastra, and we are all now talking of texts written between the late 1st millennium BC, early 1st millennium AD, there continues to be a lingering sense that animals are not only subjects. that they're also political actors. So for example, in one of the Jataka stories, the Buddha talks about the animals as Sabha Gavuttino, which means that, which has two interpretations. It can mean they become a sabha, an assembly, or that they form a collective, not much intrinsic difference between the meanings. And he takes animal assembly as an example to say to his monks that the Buddhist monks should similarly live in order within the Sangha, within the monastery. And the Jataka tales and many other ancient Indian tales, I'll come to some of them in a moment, are full of such recognition of the fact that animals live collective social political lives. The Arthashastra particularly gives attention to elephant social political life, because elephants were very important for state building and military, and talks about elephants, that there should be a bureaucracy specifically to monitor elephant collectives, the Yutha, to see that who is the leader of the Yutha, the Yuthapati, who is expelled from the Yutha, the Niruyutha, because the one who is expelled from the animal collective is more vulnerable and susceptible to human control. There are, of course, also Greek and Roman sources on animal politics. I'll discuss them towards the end of my talk. What is really interesting about these kind of viewpoints, as they never quite die down, in the 19th and 20th century, one of the classic racist British colonial arguments was that only some people are properly political, in the sense that they have constitutionalism, that they have the democratic spirits. And for most British colonial administrators, Indians were not properly political. To use Hobsbawm's term in another context, they are pre-political. So, and they are used to Oriental despotism. They are suited to despotic monarchic political forms, which is justification for colonialism. So what was the Indian response to it? Many Indian intellectuals argued that democracy is in fact universal. It's universal to the extent that even animals have it. So Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who is the most famous, I think I'll try to raise this. Yeah, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay is the most famous Indian anti-colonial nationalist writer of the 19th century. He gives this amazing sketch where there is a Bengali Western educated Babu, an elite man, who meets a monkey. And the Bengali is very proud that the British have given local self-government. And the monkey is so dismissive. The monkey says, what is this? That's not real freedom. Real freedom is what we animals have. We have true Atmashashan, true self-rule. You don't have that. And Bankim uses that to critique the colonial kind of devolution of powers, which was extremely elitist, extremely limited, as opposed to the true freedom of the animals. Or Dhanagopal Mukherjee, who's an anti-colonial Indian writer based in the United States in the early 20th century, in a lot of English books. He talks about animal social and political organization, and the one which is the most famous is about an elephant, the chief of the herd, and how the elephants operate through democratic politics. The elephants elect their own leader, and there are very sophisticated forms of intraspecies as well as interspecies communication to ward off human threats. And all of this was part of the broader Indian intellectual effort to deprovincialize democracy, to say democracy is not only not just a British European thing, it's in fact a universal species affair. Now, one of my favorite examples is that of Upendra Kishore Rai Chaudhuri, who is a very famous Indian writer, grandfather of the famous film director Satyajit Ray. So he, in another sketch, I mean, satires were often the repositories of political theory in colonial India. He talks about this cat who wants to become a tax collector. So the animals were living happily in the forest without paying taxes, but then you have this cat, Mojon Tali Sarkar. Sarkar means government in Bengali. He decides to take some papers. You can see from the sketch, he carries a scroll and decides to be the tax collector. He ends up being crushed by an elephant, which is kind of probably what we all hope state forms will end up with. Now, I'll give some more concrete examples now, a few case studies drawn, and this is the part of the world that I'll be talking about. It looks small, but in fact, West Bengal, Bangladesh, Northeastern India, Bhutan, together their population is more than 300 million. So we are talking of a population more than the UK, Britain, and France, UK, France, and Germany combined. And I'm going to talk about different parts of these. So just to see this is Bhutan. Tripura is here. This part is southern Western Bengal, Rar. This part is northern Bengal, and the Sundarbans straddle across the West Bengal, Bangladesh border around on the Bay of Bengal. So these are the different regions that I'll be talking about. So this is one of my favorite examples of multi-species constitutionalism. So Chondi Mongol is a text from 16th to 18th century southwestern Bengal from the Ra region. This is a painting by the great Bengal School of Art painter Abanindranath Tagore. So this narrative talks about animals who initially lived in a state of fear, Shodai Shoshanko, and then they approach the goddess who is called Abhaya, the fear remover. And the goddess constituted them into a constitutional monarchy to make them Niratanko, without fear. So it's a very kind of, I mean, none of these people had obviously read Hobbes. I mean, we are talking of, Southwestern Bengal, but it's a very kind of Hobbesian narrative. And then she creates this fascinating constitutional monarchy where every animal has a certain office. Now, this is not a male state. Women are pretty important. So in this painting, you can see the animals are basically women in saris. So you have the tiger woman, the lioness, the elephant woman, and the deer woman from left to right. The reason I have the woman in the picture is because then the problem arises, there's a hunter who starts hunting the animals, and the male animals can't really protect them. And then the female animals get really aggrieved, and they again complain to Chondi to protect them, etc. So it's a very interesting question about sort of animal constitutionalism, female agency, produced for audiences. I mean, it's written mostly by Brahmins, but produced clearly for audiences who are lower caste and a very demotic audience in nature. The goddess herself is part animal. She often takes animal forms as well. So again, showing the long lineages of thinking about animal politics, animal constitutional monarchy, or what we might call actually the mixed constitution in early modern India. Another fascinating text, which is composed in the 17th to 18th century in the mangrove forest delta of the Sundarbans, those of you who have read Amitav Ghosh would be familiar with this terrain, is the Rai Mongol text, which talks about a situation. So we are talking now of the early modern period, 16th, 17th, 18th century, where there is booming Indian Ocean trade. And this region is more and more connected, not just to Islamic world, but also to Europe as well, which means there are also Portuguese and Arakanis moving into the Sundarbans region. In general, it means a lot of human entry into the forest, and humans do what they do when they enter forest, or at least profit extracting humans do, they start cutting down trees. The tiger god is not particularly happy with that. This is the tiger god, Dokhinrai. So he sends 6 tigers to eat up the humans, which creates a conflict between humans and the tigers, obviously, because humans don't like to be eaten up by tigers. And Dokhinrai says, you've been cutting this tree sacred to me. Of course, I'm going to send tigers to eat you up. But ultimately, like a good story, which is not doom and gloom, the situation is revolved through a pact. And there are multiple texts in this tradition. I've looked at one text from the late 17th century, which talks about this as dostani, from the Persian word dost, friend. Now, this is a very multicultural landscape where Muslims are as important as non-Muslims, and that's why you have this Perso-Islamic terminology of pact making. Another word used is moitro. For those of you who have read your Antoine Meillet, this would be a very familiar word. It's that from which we also get the root of it. We also get words like mutual, common, commune, etc. Mauss also talks about this root. So moitro is basically, again, a pact making, and this pact making links the humans and the animals, Hindus and Muslim spirits. So, and these are not just traditions that are in ancient, well, pre-modern texts. As the anthropologist Anuja Le shows, these kinds of friendship, she also refers to the female form of friendship, Shoi Patano, which undergird multi-species constitution, what I call multi-species constitutionalism in the Sundarbans even today. So this is a photo of a shrine. You have Bon Bibi, who is a semi-Islamic spirit on her tiger. This is Barakan Ghazi or Ghazi Baba on the horse. This is Manik Pir, a protector of cows. For those who have been reading the horrid Hindu nationalist lynchings, here you have a Muslim spirit who is actually a protector of cows. And you have the Islamic Mazhar of Barakan Ghazi. So these kind of multi-religious, well, maybe multi-religious is not the right term, but multi-cult, multi-species, multi-gender kind of constitutionalism is something which is, for which we have both textual as well as ethnographic evidence. Now, these kinds of pacts are, of course, not provincial to India. Many of you might be familiar with the famous Wolf of Gubbio and what he does with St. Francis of Assisi, Il Patto della Pace, which is formed when the wolf holds out its hand or paw and makes that pact with St. Francis. So it's also there, of course, in other traditions. In the case of the Sundarbans, this kind of multi-species constitutionalism, I would argue, also undergirds the growth of socialism and Marxism in the 20th century, because by the 1940s, Sundarbans is also a hotbed of socialist, peasant revolt, etc. And whether we look at Dakshin Rai or we look at Marx, so the photo on the left is of Dakshin Rai and Barakhan Ghazi. They are friends, so they're worshipped in the same shrine. And the photo on the right is obviously of Marx and Lenin with animals. This is from a local museum in the Sundarbans, which was curated by a local antiquarian who was also a communist activist. So I would argue that forms of socialist egalitarianism, animal protection, etc., including in their Marxist forms in the Sundarbans, and I have the textual evidence to back this up, are undergirded by deep forms, deep longue durées of multi-species constitutionalism that predate Marx or Lenin. And then, of course, that brings us to the question, can we think about tree worship as an imminent critique of arboreal extractivism? And that is something I've been thinking about with the Rai Mongol. And here is a very classic example. So here is Shitala, the goddess of smallpox. She's traditionally worshipped around a tree. Now, in this case, a temporary kind of shelter temple was built for her, and then the tree covered up the shelter. So you have this very epiphanic image where the goddess emerges out of the tree. There couldn't be a better perhaps understanding of arboreal creativity there, or rewilding. So there's this tree worship kind of exemplify this, which brings us to a question that Yele and I have been thinking together, which is how can we think about animism as the political and economic theology of various forms of political economy, including that of shifting cultivation, of the forest, etc., as opposed to Lockean theology, which is about agrarian domination, state-making, taxation-making, etc. This brings me to my next point, which is about the birth of the economy as a concept in colonial India. And how does economy become a category, a self-conscious trope? And I'll just consider two examples here, which have to do with political economic considerations. One is the image on the left is of Keshab Chandra Sen, who draws on, in order to conceptualize economy as a category, he draws on the distinction between general providence and special providence to basically castigate Democrats, and there were lots of Democrats, Indian Democrats in late 19th century India, for being too egalitarian, for focusing on the rule of the general will of God, the general providence, laws. And instead, Keshav's point is that we also need special providence. We need these kinds of executive fiats, which will be implemented through prophets, through monarchs, through rajas, and so on. Because at the end, special providence is that realm of which connects the domestic economy to the monarchic economy, to ultimately the economy of salvation. So there is a sense in which economy is constructed as something linking the domestic household to the divine household via the monarchic household, and is construed against the political as a sphere, which is the rule of the general and so on. And of course, this shows us in a way that very clearly the authoritarian top-down implications of economy as a divine category as opposed to politics. And this is something which will resonate in later times as well. In the Naxalite period, we would find the Naxalite activists talking of the political as a category as opposed to the merely economistic. And they would harken back not to Keshab Chandra Sen, but to Lenin and others. But this dyad is something which we really need to think with. Now, at the same time, you also have Indian nationalists, as Manu Goswami points out in her book, conceptualizing the economy in other divine terms as a goddess. And this is a classic example of Bharat Mata, and you can see the crops in her hand, the cloth, etc., alluding to very specific points of British exploitation, deindustrialization, famine, etc. And the nation becomes then this goddess, particularly influenced by the German economist Friedrich List, the Nationalökonomie, but then that is sacralized. So you have, again, a very different interpretation of the economy, which will influence the Nehruvian political economy and its high tariff walls. So in a way, the two, one is perhaps Keshav exemplifies a kind of laissez-faire British imperial capitalism, and whereas the painting of Bharat Mata by Abanurnath Tagore signifies a form of state capitalism. But in both cases, it's ultimately a divine dirigiste kind of understanding of the economy as top-down control. Which also, of course, then raises the question, how is the economy grounded in a notion of the commodity form? And I'm thinking here with Roswitha Scholz and the whole German Wertkritik school, which talks about the sundering of the value form, the bifurcation of the value form, where economic value, productivist value as coded as male, whereas those, and this is something that came out so well in Dana's paper, that which cannot be accounted for, which is not calculable, that which is construed as care, that is coded as female. And other people in the Wertkritik school have pointed out how much the idea of male honor, male value is tied to the wage form. And Veronica Gago, she's an amazing scholar working in, especially on Argentina. She looks at the terrifying kind of impact of this on femicide, because as men lose their jobs, often the violence turns inwards against the women. So this complete collapse of the value form ultimately leads to catastrophic femicide. I've been very inspired by the work of Shubhati Dasgupta, who will be presenting tomorrow, who theorizes about colonial capitalism as a global crisis of care, which comes out from the dynamic of the commodity form. And it is very important that in India, the word for dowry, and we all know about the violence that women suffer, including gruesome deaths from dowry murders. The word for dowry, pon, and the word for commodity is ponno. So it's the same word. It's about a gender transaction. It's about the gendering of the value form, where women become degraded in value, where they become commodities. Now, what I'm really interested in is to look at resistance to this. And this is a page from an early 20th century assembly meetings of the Rajbongshi peasant communities. And Rajbongshi peasant communities in sub-Himalayan northern Bengal consistently critique commodification of women, both through bride price as well as through dowry, and said that women should not be commodified. That removes their splendor, their strength, their sri, and so on. So the criticism of patriarchy and the criticism of commodity form becomes linked together in the colonial capitalist economy in fundamental ways. And at the same time, the critique of commodity production, the word for production in Bengali, in modern Bengali, is utpadon, and ut carries the sense of something which is uprooted. So production in a way as a fundamental outrooting. Ut is obviously cognate to the English out. As opposed to that, Rajbongshis also Rajbongshi peasants point to the importance of jotno, care for the non-human. And this is a page from, again, an early 20th century assembly meeting. So these are minutes of the peasant meetings that happened involving kind of thousands of peasants, many of them first generation literate, many of them not literate at all, happening, where they talk about that cows cannot only be treated as means of production, but they should be dealt with as beings towards whom we owe jotno, care. Now, that leads us to the next question, that how can we think about the transition from being to unbeing? And there was a question in the last panel about vampire making. And I think vampire making is very central to understanding the dynamic of the commodity form, as anthropologists have shown. Yele's work has worked on northeastern India among the Khasis, where the Khasis conceptualize the dynamic of profit making as a vampirical serpent sucking the blood of human beings, and demanding human sacrifice. Edwin Ardener's celebrated work on the Bakweri in Africa also shows very clearly how capitalism is understood as zombie making, that that humans are reduced to the undead, to zombies, and that is how people understand the process of proletarianization. So what we theorize is that there is a kind of three-step movement. In the first step of encounter with the commodity form, we have these kind of fascinating images where capitalism is understood as monster making. At the second level, as this famous quotation from Marx's Capital shows, this is also theorized about very explicitly, that capital is vampire-like, it is like a serpent, and one needs to resist it. At the same time, what happens is that the beingness of beings, the beingness of human and non-human beings, is reduced to abstraction by the operation of capitalism. So first their beings are reduced to zombies, and then they are merely transformed into categories. And this comes out, in fact, what happens is a kind of desouling. And this is something that we often talk about, that person is heartless. But that's, of course, the logic of profit making. It is about unsouling. And here, of course, we have to think with Hegel in Philosophy of Right about how capitalism, about how property making is fundamentally, as Hegel says, removing the souls of beings and transplanting one's own soul into it. Now, for the Rajbongshi peasants that I'm talking about, they were very conscious that what is happening with capitalism is theft. And they speak about the theft of value, the theft of labor, the theft of land. And in fact, I think for India, it is very important to think about caste as primitive accumulation. Now, it starts as anciently as the time of the Vedas and so on, but certainly in the colonial period, it is universalized, intensified. So people like the Rajbongshis or the indigenous people of Tripura and the Adivasi Dalit population in general, there is mass scale removal of them from land, conversion of them into workers. And this primitive accumulation is coded through the logic of the caste form. And the Rajbongshis are, of course, when they're critiquing caste hierarchies, they are critiquing essentially this logic of primitive accumulation. Which brings me then to a concept history of how capital is imagined in Bengali thought. Now, it's very interesting that in Sanskrit, the word for capital is Mooladhana, which would be something like root wealth. But in Bengali, as far as etymological dictionaries of Bengali show that in the 18th century, a fundamental transition happens. A new word emerges, puji, which is the word in Bengali that is today used for capital. And this derives from punjo, which is the Sanskrit and Bengali word for accumulation. And I think this has to do with a new accumulative dynamic of capital, which the old Mooladhana cannot quite capture. But from the very earliest moment, there is also a critique of capital developing, and especially from a kind of agrarian peasant perspective. If we look at a text like Rameshwar Bhattacharya's Shivayan, there the goddess herself, the goddess Chondi, whom we have encountered a little while before, she says capital and deceit are the root of trade, and instead says agriculture is better because that is the true foundation. Peasants are the ones who are like the god Shiva who protect the human beings. And this is a trajectory which continues even today, that there is a continuous critique of capital happening in modern India, where true nourishing other beings is posited against the deceitfulness of capital. Now, capital is also, of course, conceptualized as a false god. When Marx is translated into post-colonial Bengali, the word commodity idolatry, ponno pouttalikota, is used to translate capital. So, to translate commodity fetishism. Against this kind of capitalist dynamic, and we have to understand that capitalism sometimes promises equality, but it's an equality in the supermarket, in the marketplace. When it comes to the realm of production itself, capital is despotic. So capitalism in peasant discourses appears as a form of despotism, as a form of value extraction, and that then spurs on the peasant understanding of autonomy as a transition from the rule of master to self-rule, to ultimately, it's fascinatingly anarchistic, to the negation of all rule. It's an amazing dialectic that emerges. And in Rajbongshi politics, as this image shows, the woman on the left is the mother of the man on the right. Both men and women play a very important role in Rajbongshi agrarian socialism. This brings us also, of course, to the question of economic theology. Richard Seaford's fantastic work shows how in both ancient Greece and India, as the money form became the general equivalent, different things could be thought of as being rendered equivalent because there was a substrate of beingness, which was the same, the ontological beingness which equated them, which is coded in ancient Sanskrit as Brahman. Now, what happens in colonial India is that when capitalism is understood as commodifying heteronomy, People like Qazi Nazrul Islam, who is, along with Iqbal, the most important Indian Muslim writer of modern India, they understand the process of overcoming capital as a fundamental question of overcoming heteronomy. So Nazrul Islam develops this dialectic where he says, we have made the mistake of thinking that other people are gods and we are slaves. If we can overcome this self-negation, being swahin, this negation of the self, we have to negate this negation. So that would be a double negation. And then we will realize the divinity within ourselves, and that will help us bring about revolution. And he understands socialist revolution through the Islamic understanding of Qiyama and the Hindu understanding of Pralaya. He also translates, he's the first to translate the Bengali, the Lante Nacional into Bengali, as well as produce ideas about the messianicity of laboring men and women. And all of this is coming out basically from fundamental critiques of the top-down understanding of economy. I think I'll need 10, 15 more minutes. Hopefully that would be. I shift then to another corner of India, northeastern India. Now, northeastern India is perhaps familiar to many of you because for James Scott, the Zomia extends from northeastern India through Southeast Asia. Now, in this map, what I show is where Tripura, which is a state in northeastern India, melanges into the Bengal plains. And as you can see from to the right, you have these very hilly landscape. Now, the difference in political economy between the Bengal plains and northeastern India, where in a way James Scott's Zomia starts, is fundamental. Because in the Bengal plain, you have a sedentary agrarian population who can be taxed by the state. In the hills, you have highlanders practicing shifting cultivation, who cannot be taxed by the state. Shifting cultivation evades state. And James Scott was quite right in saying that. However, a monarchy, a kingship does develop because in Tripura, because it is able to tax the peasants in the Bengali plains. But this kingship is a very brittle one because it escapes control from the highlanders. Now, this dialectic of state evasion, and again, if you remember, James Scott's book was criticized by a lot of people who said that where is the evidence that people are criticizing the state? And again, as an intellectualist, and I love it when the evidence turns up. So the Rajmala is a text that is composed between the 16th and 19th century. It is the state chronicle of Tripura. And it's very interesting that the Rajmala continually talks about how the highlanders, the people emerge as an abstract category there much before any kind of Western influence. The words are Loka, Praja, and so on, the Jana, etc. And they continually come together to basically remove rulers. Now, the fundamental political act here is an act of regicide, where the god Shiva, and here Shiva is portrayed in one of his early medieval iconic forms in Tripura. The god, so there is this first king, and what he does is basically does whatever tyrants do, assault, sexually assault women, take away people's property, kill men, and very important also, he kills a lot of animals, especially elephants and horses, presumably to carry out his war. And then the people come together and they actually retreat into the hills. And this is not James Scott, this is really the Rajmala. The people retreat into the hills, they come together. And then what happens is, of course, the god Shiva comes and kills the king. And the Rajmala draws the very wise conclusion, whenever a king will harm his subject, Shiva will kill the ruler. Now, this first episode is very mythic, but in subsequent episodes, the people are always the people, or sometimes the military and administrative officers. They very regularly come together to depose king, kill the king, elect a new king, etc. And this really shows how Highlander politics is about a continual negotiation and renegotiation of social contract. Now, just to turn for a moment back to the political economy question, again, economically speaking, the Highlanders every year, they would negotiate and renegotiate their social contract with their ruler, which I think again makes the idea of social contract a much more regular occurrence, a much more periodic cyclical occurrence than the one-time social contract that the Hobbesian Leviathan premised on. Here is the continual contract. And Yele's work, as well as the work of Eric de Marquer on the Garos in northeastern India, shows how this continuous contractuality is also done with the spirits themselves. So as the Highlanders move to a new field, every time a new contract has to be negotiated with the new spirits of the field through guest-host relationship. So this is not a one-time contract where God has given the land to Adam in perpetuity. Now, what all of this means is, in a way, what we might call a sense of perpetual revolution. Continuously, polities are, defying their rulers, bringing down the king, and so on. And this continues into the 19th century, where there are endless amounts, including in the rebellion of 1857, resistances against the British state. And ultimately, what happens by the early to mid 20th century is the development of an indigenous constitutionalism, and by the 1940s of an indigenous communist movement. And the communist movement really draws from these longue durée traditions. From 1947 onwards, a lot of Bengalis start moving into Tripura in consequence of the partition. Indigenous resistance is crushed by the post-colonial Indian state. But ultimately, through decades of insurgent politics, the indigenous people are able to carve out 2/3 of the land of Tripura as their own autonomous territory. So it's a really fascinating story of centuries-old indigenous resistance to very violent and extractivist state making. And again, the Rajmala calls this the ideology of prani ahingsha, non-violence towards beings. That's a very important part of the political culture there that I think is definitely what indigenous Tripuri intellectuals call prothagato ganatantra, customary democracy. Now, this leads us then to understand democracy, indigenous democracy, in ways that are not about the modern Western bourgeois state. In my own book and in works that Yele has written on Naga democracy, as well as his edited stuff, it is very clear that there exists ancient traditional multi-species democracies, multi-species constitutionalisms in South Asia and of course elsewhere in the world that far predate what bourgeois states claim to be democracy, which are then guarded by the army and the police and so on. And these are often really multi-species democracies. Yele's work on Nagaland shows how the Nagas believe that it is not only humans who engage in assemblies, and they do it against the Indian state, because the problem is in Naga assemblies, the focus is on collective decision making, and whereas the Indian state instrumentalized the Westminster model of elections, which was about one man, one vote. So what the Nagas ended up doing is they would form collective assemblies, decide who they would vote for, and then they would all vote for that person, which kind of tears apart Western understandings of individual liberalism and so on. So the Nagas not only privilege collective life, but they also think that tigers and pythons and spirits all live in collectives, all live in assemblies. Tigers have very serious discussions about, for example, where to go hunting and things like that. And this is obviously a very fascinating multi-species understanding of assemblies. And we were very fortunate that Senganglu Thaime, who's a Naga artist, she drew for us this fantastic artwork to conceptualize this multi-matrix Naga democracy. Another example that Yele works on, and I've been thinking with Yele as well, is about Bhutan, where as well you have a more than human demos. So what Yele is doing at the moment is he's collecting a lot of ethnographic information on the kind of customary norms through which humans deal with various species. For example, cranes are seen as models of monogamy and therefore should not be killed. Vultures are seen as models of ethical behavior because they don't kill living beings, and again, therefore they should not be killed. Yaks are seen as sentient beings, and it is said that in one age, yaks are herdsmen of humans, in another age, humans are herdsmen of yaks, reminds us of Plato. So they're very sophisticated understandings of these multi-species norms. And basically, Yele is collecting a lot of the key concepts here. I'm trying to trace their roots also into Tibetan and to Sanskrit Buddhist vocabularies of happiness, of norm, etc., to understand how the modern human demos functions. Which ultimately brings me to my point that we need to provincialize man as political animal. Every political textbook worth its salt begins with the statement, man is a political animal. What it completely forgets is that Plato also talked about bees and wasps and ants as political species. Aristotle also talked about bees, wasps, ants, and cranes as political creatures, and gave very sophisticated formulations about typological differences between animals, some submitting to rulers, to others not. Virgil's Georgics is a text that continually inspires me in the way that he thinks about the bees as constituting a gens, divided into populi, living under the laws, sub legibus, and sharing a part in divine intelligence. And he also talks about the wills of commoners, animi vulgi, which is present among the bees. And here to the left, you have an early modern artwork focusing on the first paragraphs of Virgil's Georgics, and more recent scientific research, which confirms the classics are not always wrong. The classics are not always fuddy-duddy. They have a lot of good elements of truth in them. Honeybees do have democracies. And also even more recent research, Animal Democracy, there was a fantastic Arte documentary which set off Yele's and mine thoughts by Emma Baus, and her documentary shows how a gamut of creatures, from bees to elephants particularly are females have a very important role in politics there, to different kinds of horses, to bisons, all practice collective decision making. So it's not just as the traditional understanding was, of course, patriarchally shaped, the all thought gives the decision making. No, it's not so simple. It's animals often collectively take decisions, and women and children also have a role there. We are now getting a much more sophisticated understanding of those facts. One of my colleagues in St. Andrews, Luke Rendell and Hal Whitehead, talk about the cultural lives of whales and dolphins. And all of this help us to understand what, in a way, humanity has always known, that animals are not mere commodities. They are not mere objects that, you can do genocides on and accumulate in the supermarket. They're also cultural and political actors. So what Yele and Dad at the moment are doing, we are intersecting intellectual history, ethnography, and biology to write a book on animal democracy, to think about critiquing capitalism. And my last slide, I'm so doing with time. Anyway, so my point is we need to unlearn the economy. The economy was globalized as a category by colonial violence. And we need to fracture this irredeemably colonial term, which elides, which removes, which ruptures the political and the ethical. We need to bring together all of these factors together. And I don't think it's unusual that there is no South Asian word for economy before the colonial period. The word that is now today translated as economy, orthoniti, is actually a word that has completely different meanings in pre-colonial period. It fuses statecraft and many other things. So the important thing is to treat other human and non-human beings not as commodities, but as political actors. And we need to criticize the commodity form. We could begin in different ways. We could start giving wages to animals, but then, as you know, there was a time when feminists demanded wages for housework. The whole gamut of invisibilizing labor can be transcended, but then we perhaps need to abolish the wage form and commodity form altogether and create a politics, the multi-species democracy, where animals will and where different species will care for each other in interdependence. And the more powerful the species, and humans are the most powerful species, have a greater responsibility there than others. And we create a constitution in our pamphlet, or not a constitution, but a perpetual revolution, a turning of the wheel of law. Rekin. Across much of South Asia and many other parts of the world, human and non-humans recognize each other as kin, not as mere capitalists and workers. We need to rekin the world. We need to reanimate the world, recognize that non-human beings are also animate and sentient. In Bhutan, at the heart of politics is the understanding that all beings are sentient. And in ancient Buddhism, as Ellie Finley points out, she shows amazingly how in ancient Buddhism, the fact tree sentience was recognized also led to actually preventing deforestation and so on. And we know that in Britain, we now have debates about recognizing the sentience and intelligence of lobsters and octopuses and so on. And this has very concrete implications for public policy today. So reanimate, renomad, abolish state borders. For the Bhutanese yaks, a major problem was when after the Sino-Indian War, the borders became frozen and animals could not, the yaks could not go to pastures. Birds still fly. So we should re-avianize territory and rewild. Domestication, state-making, colonialism, these different forms of domestication should be abolished. We should ultimately intersect class, gender, racial, and environmental justice to fight the capitalocene, because the burden of multi-species reproduction, social reproduction, is often unfairly spent on women and non-white people. What would a post-colonial yuck feminist revolution look like then? So there are yuck feminists, believe it or not, because whenever you try to over milk the yuck women, they resist with headbutts and kicks and so on. And that's true for yuck men too sometimes. And Yele's ethnographic work shows how yucks are very sophisticated ways of spreading animal resistance, which Ranajit Go would be very proud of, contagion of resistance. One animal starts grunting and soon the rebellion spreads and you have a collective resistance. What the Bhutanese then often do is then basically expel that troublemaker. But what perhaps multi-species feminism would look like is a number of things. Don't overmilk the yuck women, let them remain with their children. Let the expelled Zulu, the expelled sovereign, return back to the yuck herd so that human sovereignty is replaced by animal sovereignty. Don't castrate the yuck men and let the men fight amongst each other. So we have a little bit non-monarchic power distribution. Women will have the right to choose their mates and perhaps or not to have any mate at all. And then we would have a post-monarchic, post-colonial polycracy where there would be multi-species well-being. And modern scientific research can dialogue with a lot of indigenous knowledge which exists among the Bhutanese, among Indians, and many other communities about what animals like. These are knowledges that we don't have, but herdsmen have and other people. And this is wonderful artwork made by Pema Gyaltshen, who's a Bhutanese artist, to show this kind of multi-species feminist revolution and with cranes and yucks and men and women and the turning of the wheel of law that we all dream about. And that brings me to a close, that how can we critique capitalism and state and all these long histories of doom and gloom and save the planet is maybe through overcoming the commodity form, overcoming the state form, overcoming this mad self-valorization of value, which profits profit-making as the only ontology, and bring back other values, other ontologies, and especially multi-species demos and multi-species democracy. Thank you.